Welcome back to the Scaling Theory podcast. My guest today is Thomas Wolff. Thomas is the co-founder of Hugging Face, a company that has become a central part of the generative AI ecosystem, thanks in part to its Transformers library and its platforms that allows users to share AI models and datasets. Thomas and I are both French, and we both live in the Netherlands. So we decided to meet somewhere in Amsterdam to talk face-to-face about the future of generative AI. In this conversation, you will learn about why open source AI is preferable to closed source AI, whether open source has a real chance to take over the space, the challenges that open source developers have to overcome to scale their foundation models, the role of data and infrastructure in scaling dynamics, how big tech companies position themselves in the ecosystem, and how they respond to other companies' strategies in a true complexity science fashion, and overall about the power laws that undermine the growth of the ecosystem. First, I asked Thomas how it all started with Hugging Face. I asked, more specifically, to explain the path of the company from its inception to having 350,000 models, 75,000 data sets, and 150,000 demo apps. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
So it started roughly 7 years ago when we decided to create kind of a modern version of Tamagotchi, or like a game, interactive game, with the idea that with the recent progress in deep learning, was mostly about computer vision at this time, could maybe enable us to make something much more interactive, much more exciting as kind of a talking being on your cell phone or something than was before. And while we were building this thing, we actually open sourced a couple of bricks that we had. And these bricks got so much attention that when we were thinking about raising our Series A, we decided to pivot to open source. So first open source libraries and very quickly open source hosting, which is still what we do 5 years later. Hugging Face is mostly a model data set demo hosting company. Yeah. And we've decided that open source, open access, open science is something that's beautiful in AI and very needed.
How did it scale? Again, just talking about Hugging Face, I mean, you know all of those numbers, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's quite impressive that you managed to convince all of those big companies, so you must have done something right. So how did it start from being a Tamagotchi company to the leading player, I suppose it is today in the space?
It's a combination of many elements, I would say. I mean, the numbers are actually even better, even bigger. We have
bigger than that.
we have half a million models now on the hub, but it's exponential. So anyway, if you're like a couple of weeks late, it's crazily. I think the first thing is that it took some time. Open source community building this take times. It's not like something you do in 2 months. It's something that you need to do over long term. So that's why also our first investors were always really aligned with this idea that we're building something on the long term. So our first big open source library was Transformers. That was 2018. So that's now almost 6 years ago. So that takes times, and you have to really believe in the mission. You have to believe that it's something that you want to do. Somehow it has to be more than just for the money, right? So there is something, at a couple of moments we could have stopped or we could have sold the company, but we decided not to because we believed really in the mission that we wanted to push. So that's one thing. And then I would say 2 other things. There's definitely a component of riding this huge wave of AI. So we were there at the right moment, also at the right place when AI started, and there is an effect of just AI becoming suddenly super big. And I would say the last one would be the culture of the company. Really building a culture where we have people who really think open source, open science sharing is important. And that we try to, a lot of people stay and come work at Hugging Face because of this, because they believe, they could work in a lot of closed source companies, building models, building data set, but they think that the open source community, that's something that's worth building.
I'll ask a question later on regarding a open source company becoming a closed source company. But so I presume this won't be the path that Hugging Face will take. So taking a step back, just looking at open source, generally speaking, we hear a lot about, open source versus closed source. What would be the main argument in favor of open source in the space?
Yeah, there's a lot of them, I think. I would say maybe a very very general argument is we're building here something that is changing really humanity. That's a revolution that's as big as the internet and probably much bigger, I think. Like it's as big as, some of the industrial revolution. I don't want this to be just the property of two US tech companies. I think it's very sad when you think in the future you have just one company that has this technology. It was as if today electricity was, just General Electric. That's the only company who can build electricity. No, we don't want that. That's like obviously the beginning of a dystopia in the future. That's the beginning of a future we don't want. I think for this stuff, it's just like physics or this very generic thing. They should just be common good of everyone. Just like, Richard Feynman said, okay, if I can create it, I don't understand it. That's the same with AI. I want to understand it. I want to be able to create it. And I think everyone should be able to understand. So that's a very generic thing why I believe open source is just something we want. But more practically, all the security software today is open source software. Like the basic of enterprise servers is Unix, Ubuntu. Open source is just something that's usually generally much more robust because everyone can understand it, everyone can fix the failures when you see it. That's just something that has been proven more robust in software for many things. So I want my AI to be robust. I want to understand why when I ask ChatGPT, who should I vote for as a president, he give me this answer. I want to be able to dive in data set to understand why it's giving me this answer. So I think open source is very important for that. And then there's a lot of question about integrating more stakeholders. We don't want only these certain people, training GPT-4 at OpenAI to be the one that decide everything for the models. We want to be able to give our opinion how it should be trained, to experiment with other things. What Yann Lequin is saying about alignment, if we want to align a model with some ethical, moral values, you want to have a diversity of actors involved in that, obviously. You want to have also maybe European models that are aligned with maybe more European values. So all of this, you can do that much more easily if you have an open source model than if you need to ask and to beg a company to make a model that's aligned with, some values or some ethical acts that we have in Europe. And there are many others that I need to...
Obviously, yeah. And I do think that the word democratization is actually on the mission statement of Hugging Face, still on your website. So it seems to be the word, right?
But it's a complex, it's an annoying word because like every word like this, it has kind of lost its meaning with time. Everyone is democratizing everything. So you can democratize something by, just making an app that give access to everyone without opening anything about your tech. So I don't really like this word anymore. When we started to have it in the early days, it was kind of unique. But now it will be hard to find an AI company who's not democratizing something. So, but I think open access is still something very specific to what we want to push. Yeah.
If you're listening to this podcast, go on Hugging Face website as soon as you can, because that word may disappear in the near distant future.
Keep it. It just lost its meaning.
Okay, so taking the other side, some people are saying that open source is actually too dangerous, especially giving the power of those foundation models. So what do you make of this argument?
Yeah, I think a lot of these arguments are about fear-mongering. For instance, these models are just trained on data accessible on the internet, right? So when a model tells you how to build a nuclear power plant, it's not the model that discovered this on itself. It didn't create anything. I mean, it was just trained on internet data that ask you and that tell you how to build a nuclear power plant. So I would say the internet is dangerous. A computer is already very dangerous because you can also hack other computers with a computer. So, I mean, a lot of the fear that we see around AI model, they're just not new. Surprisingly, we were not asking them before about the internet. Should this data be there? Should data about bioweapon be on the internet and used to train a model? Well, maybe not, maybe yes, but yeah. Should we have Linux distribution that are special for hacking? They exist. There is some specific Linux distribution that has all the tool to hack network. They're not so used to, they're not so difficult to use, right? So all these tools we already had there. So a lot of these problems, they're just not really new. They're still the same. We have a computer that can do dangerous thing. How do we prevent that? And that's more at the system level usually, It's like having some law enforcement around that. Maybe some data should stay private and not be used to train models and this type of thing. But that was just there before. We didn't change a lot. Yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think there was a recent investigation about the bioweapon, because that's a danger that's very often put forward, that show that actually there is not a significant difference in the capability to build bioweapon using the information you have on the internet or an AI model. So.
Yeah. Now, trying to predict the future, so we talked about the pros and supposedly the cons, or at least some people would say are the cons of open source foundation models. On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that the leading models in, let's say, 5-10 years will actually be open source?
10. No, 10 for various reasons. I mean, first is, I would say, the landscape that we see today. In the beginning of March 2024, we see a lot of open source model, much more than before, and that's actually an increasing thing. For various reasons, for new startups, all the teams that are training LLMs now, they leave their former startups, they go to create new ones, they leave Google, Facebook, they create Mistral and so on and so on. They leave DeepMind, they create Grok with Elon Musk. So all these teams know how to train this model. They build this new structure, this new entity, they want to get known. What do? They train a very large open source model. That's the best way to be very visible, to have $1 billion company, Yi, Mistral, all of them. So it's just a very natural way to get known. And I don't see any worldwide ban on open source model being enacted, So for all these reasons. And anyway, I don't think, today we have GPT-4. 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, was GPT-2. We said, that was very dangerous. Then came GPT-3. We were like, GPT-2 is actually not dangerous anymore. Then came GPT-4. We were like, GPT-3 is actually not dangerous anymore. So in 2 years, we'll have GPT-6, and we'll say, GPT-4 is actually very innocuous and it can be open source. So they will always be slightly late, slightly, defaced for sure, because a private source has this unfair advantage that it can read and benefits from open source, but not the other way around. But that's fine. Also, we can do a lot of very interesting things without having kind of AGI crazy model. Really.
We also have to remember that jazz was deemed to be dangerous, and bicycles, because it will allow women to go in other villages, and this will be the end of morality. So interesting to take some perspective. Okay.
That's right.
Moving on now to survival and the strategy, which will be part 2 of our conversation. What do you think are the main challenges for open source foundation models to actually scale and survive, which I would argue is probably the same, right? Because if you do not grow and acquire more users, it could be hard to survive. So you said you are very confident open source is here to stay and will dominate the space. But in terms of challenges, what do you see on the way?
Yeah, so there is still this question as always around open source, which is business model is trickier to get, right? So that's what we were talking about that before you started podcast. If you close something, the business is usually easier to explain. You're selling something, and usually what's more tricky is user acquisition. You need get known. You need to get open source reverse this thing. It's usually easier to get users because it's free, because you can advertise, because people can even participate in the creation of this. But it's harder to make a business model that match this because you have a part of your thing that's free. So I think it's still you can invent new things, and I find quite interesting that people are experimenting with new things. So just yesterday, this new Cohere model was released. So it's very interesting. Cohere was kind of a closed model company, never release any model. And all of a sudden they release Aya, which was this kind of career for ML non-profit. And just yesterday, Command, which is like a very good quality, large model that they make open source. And it has this license that lets researchers use this, and you need to come take a license if you're a company. The same for Llama, actually. If you have more than 700 million users, that so many people have, but yeah, you need to take a license. So I think this kind of licensing experiments are very interesting. And then you have various set of business model, I would say, including the one of Hugging Face, which go around consulting, maybe having some closed model and some open source, like what Mistral is doing at the moment, or maybe doing some like specific adaptation of your model that you make that you pay, or having this freemium thing, which is a bit what we are doing. So when you have a large enough user base, you can make a lot of this free if you just sell a couple of things. So it's less obvious to make this business model, but on the other hand, you have a lot of things you can try. So I'm not so worried, but I think we'll have a diversity of business model. Yeah. There is this possibility that model building will be commoditized. That's possibility. That's like making model will not be something that you buy anymore. And that's the rest, the vertical adaptation of the model for one field, or maybe the hardware that go around models. So, and that's a very real possibility, I think. Yeah. Just we'll have so good open model that nobody will really pay for that.
And something, of course, that we did not mention yet is that when we talk about open source or open access, it is on the spectrum, right? So from fully being open source to where you could take the model and then change it and sell it, which would be the MIT license, to something which is more, closer to closed proprietary models.
Yeah, there is interesting parallel actually. And it's not so obvious, right? Because AI models are more complex. You have the data, the code, the model weights. And these are all parts that can be or cannot be open, right? So when we say open model, it's very rarely mean all three, which is one extreme on the spectrum that maybe just a couple of teams has done. So maybe Big Science was one and Elither, but a couple of them. But you can have just open access model or something I never really saw, but on a model where the data would be open and not the model. Like you can have like a various spectrum of access, and open source is just a binary distinction that doesn't reflect that usually.
Yeah. So if we go on the other end of the spectrum, we have those closed models. And so the way I understand the ecosystem, and I'm curious to hear your thought on that, is that those foundation models, they benefit from increasing returns in a sense that the more users, the more you can generate profits. The more profits, the more you can access to unique data, because big data, it seems, is accessible to even small companies, but having access to unique data sets such as YouTube transcripts or emails, if you are Google and Microsoft, can help a lot. And so it seems that the ability that some companies have to push their models to billions of users in just a minute is very valuable. So would you agree with that statement? And I guess the question is, how worried should the big tech companies be in 2024 in terms of their chances of survival?
Yeah, I don't think I agree so much. I think that's the old motto of big data, right? It's like data is the moat. That's what we've been saying for a long time. What is surprising in AI is that very small new team and team that don't have access to their data set can still train pretty good quality models. So this challenge this idea. One reason for that is the internet is there. It's kind of free access for everyone. So it's like you have this big hole everywhere under the ground. Anyone can just dig and get some oil. And so that's one thing. And if you carefully refine this, there's a lot of science around refining this data set to extract, but you can extract actually a lot of things from the internet or for a thing that you can crawl. So you would have to really you would have to have a very carefully protected corner of the internet. So one example, let's say, it's quite well known that the good Whisper model from OpenAI, which is a speech-to-text model that transcribes speech to text, it's one of the best right now, was just trained on YouTube. because it has some strange hallucination when there is no sound where it says, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, something like that. They just crawl it. They don't have YouTube. OpenAI doesn't have YouTube access, they just crawl it because it's openly accessible on the internet. And so all these questions, a lot of these small startups are just doing these type of things. And this challenge the fact that, Google is really protected, for instance. So they do have this email and stuff like that. But, first, is the quality of text in emails really high? I would doubt it, knowing my personal emails are not always. And the same for discussion, like Facebook as Messenger, WhatsApp. Okay, but most of the discussion, sorry, but they're pretty bad quality. You don't really need them in your data set, actually. That's one learning we had also when we were a chatbot company. And so we had a lot of interaction with users. Like our product was actually quite used at some point. Yeah. We had like millions of interaction. A lot of this is actually really bad quality. Mm-hmm. Not a lot of them raised to the level of this podcast, which is very, very high quality. But even the podcast, you can just listen them on Spotify and transcribe them. So yeah, it's very hard to build a moat around these openly accessible things. Yeah.
But so, what do you make of lawsuits such as the New York Times versus OpenAI, right? Where, there are speculations as to maybe one day you have to pay to get access to the OpenAI with the New York Times, data being in the data set. Don't you see that there is a risk there in terms of licenses? Because, of course, some companies would be able to afford to pay those licenses to, let's say, the New York Times, and others may not. Or do you see that as being not so important in terms of dynamics in the space?
No, that's a big change. Yeah, for sure. It's actually surprising. It only comes now, but with the time scale of this lawsuit, I don't know when it will be fully decided for sure. Yeah. If we compare that with the time scale of AI development, but that could change a lot, right? If the future is a world where very important source like newspaper or I don't know, like big websites, like Wikipedia or Reddit or Stack Overflow is another important places where they wanted really decide to go and force access or at least use for training model of their data. That could change a lot, and in particular, I could concentrate power in the hands of a couple of companies who can pay the 60 million or the 100 million that's required to use the data, and that I think would be very unfortunate. What would be if we picture a world like this, then I guess we likely will have some place in the world, like Japan is interesting because they have a law that allow for training models on this thing. Huh? Yeah. So we'll have various like lawsuits in various places, various interpretation of the law, and we may have concentration in unexpected area where like Japan suddenly become attractive. For what I know, I don't know, like the Emirates or some place that decide, okay, we want to use. Just like the Emirates use common law region to attract companies to Dubai, for instance, and start this financial quarter, they could use this kind of regional law to attract AI startup and build some hubs. So that's quite interesting. Just a bit the same, like a ban of open source seems unlikely. I think a very coordinated law program at the world scale seems hard. There is obviously copyright law that have worked quite well, but that was over the course of a century. You probably know better, but I think it was a very long time to get this to work. And in the end, it's a matter of power balance, I would say. So who will be the most powerful between AI companies, AI lobbies, and publisher lobbies? Yeah. Very likely, yeah.
So yeah, on that, this is a lot of what we've heard to justify the AI Act just in Europe, right? One idea that the policymakers pushed is that this will be good in terms of creating some uniform rules, which is true. But then the question is whether or not you like this uniformity, right? So you may prefer sometimes not to have some uniformity if you think the rule is actually not the good one. So if we were to have just one law for the entire world saying that you cannot train foundation models based on data on the internet, I'm not sure if I would like this kind of uniformity. But so maybe competition between countries and regions, that this could be one of the landscape. If I move on to now, so the strategy part in terms of indeed how do you react to changes in this environment? something I've argued in writing is that the mental model of what I would call the 2010s, meaning the big tech companies versus the rest of the world, does not really fit well when it comes to Gen AI and foundation models, because you see some big tech companies on one side of the spectrum and other big tech companies on the other side of the spectrum. So what do you make of that? Do you think we should let go again of this idea of opposing big tech to other tech companies when it comes to AI?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, in particular because Meta has this very paradoxical position today, right? Well, I mean, it might be changing, but they have this very paradoxical position where they are the only one like pushing for open source. Could change as well because Google is kind of struggling and they start to open source models. And in some way, the distance between these large big tech companies and smaller incumbents is not so big. So like Cohere or OpenAI, they're like OpenAI is almost a big tech company, I would say, right now in terms of AI. They can definitely make people dance. Yeah, I don't know if I have a strong opinion on this, in particular because I feel like this is one of the things that's changing maybe the fastest in the landscape at the moment. Yeah. So the release of a Llama 3 could change again, a lot. Maybe push Google to try to release something as well, or like Microsoft. Yeah. No, I don't think I have some very long-term insights on this.
So yeah, it's very dynamic, but in any case, what we did not see so far is that all the big tech companies will all be promoting closed source models, right? This is not the case.
No.
They come and go and adapt to the strategies of others.
Yeah.
Something else is, so again, talking about the big tech companies, it seems that not all of them, it's one way of saying it, are pushing for open source just for the sake of it. It may also be a business strategy. And I see at least two strategies here. One would be to undermine the value of a proprietary model that another big tech companies may be pushing for. And the second strategy might be that you actually do indeed want to commoditize that model, not interested in making money at that layer, but if you think you can sell products that will function on top of the foundation model, this may be a good business model.
Yeah. I think that's for sure. For instance, in code, if we do the analogy of software, that's for sure one good way to see the evolution of Microsoft, for instance, right? So from a very closed source company to a company that have actually a very well used open source component, like Visual Studio Code is open source, is one of the most widely used. GitHub is obviously, I mean, not open source in code, but the home of open source. So there is this strong push, and the idea is clearly to have just like Meta is doing now, to have these components that are used by everyone because they are free, because they're open, and to use that as an entry point in, like a paid, which could be one way to do business for open source startup, though it requires quite some investment and a full stack of things so that you can both have a free component that everyone uses and at the same time build some tightly integrated closed source components. So it's quite a lot of things to do. But you could imagine free, very high quality models that somehow just well integrated within your own closed source offering of totally different tools. Like embeddings, for instance, one way, Cohere has just open sourced this very nice model I was saying, but it's also very nicely tuned to their own embeddings, but are not open source. So when you do RAG, when you do retrieval, you actually want to use very likely their own embeddings. So you could have this thing where actually something that's very costly is free to build, and very complex is free because you're selling something else that's actually different, maybe much simpler. So that's what Microsoft has been doing. Meta could have this type of strategy where you have Llama, which is this idea of building the most widely used model by everyone, and then that's kind of why it's not super clear how Meta plan to monetize the AI components, but I think that's an idea that can make sense in a very long-term plan where this model is actually well integrated as a product. Could it be this revival of Metaverse or something like that? I think it's a nice strategy, and I think if Google were able to be a bit less self-focused. That's a strategy they could also do well because they have this nice tradition of open source. Microsoft is more seems like at the moment playing on every every places. And I would say at Hugging Face, so Hugging Face is really mostly this model hosting platform. So what's good for Hugging Face at the moment is to have as much diversity as possible. So I would say we're more like a Switzerland or a neutral party, like looking all these very large companies fighting against each other and releasing model to fight against each other, and that's kind of good for us, I would say. Yeah. We would like it even better if it was also even more diverse. So not just very large company releasing models, but also smaller one. So that's a lot of our effort at the moment, which is what I was presenting this morning here in this graduate classes, which is trying to give all the basic blocks for people to be able to train themselves their model. And when I mean people, I mean research groups, maybe smaller startups, maybe all the people who are not exactly in these very large billion-dollar revenue companies. And so the idea is to give them good quality libraries, good quality data sets, good recipes, good knowledge, so that they can also themselves train good model and bring even more diversity to this field. Yeah.
And so one other strategy might be to first advertise yourself as a open source company or project and eventually to close it down, right? And so nowadays we're talking a lot about OpenAI because Elon Musk just introduced a lawsuit against them. Now it's a complicated story because they also released emails showing that Elon Musk also pushed for the model to be closed. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about what's happening behind the scenes. So not talking about that case, but talking about that strategy, generally speaking. So again, going from open to closed, are you fine with it? Do you think it should always be okay? It should never be legal, or are you somewhere in between?
I'm somewhere in between in that. I think it's fine. Like, at the end of the day, when you create your startup, you also want to make some money. So usually when you try with open source, and if it doesn't work and you're kind of short, you should be able to run to the closed source part just for the sake of surviving. So I'm not advocating for everyone to let the startup die before, sorry, they made the wrong choice. I'm also not so worried because I think for every startup that goes closed source, you have a new open source startup that rise somehow, just because then the field is open. Like right now, Mistral don't kind of moved a little bit to closed source at the moment. And I guess a lot of people are like, oh, now is my time to train maybe the best open source model because the room is open. And the same with OpenAI, when they decided to close access to their model, they opened the way for Meta Llama to be released and for Mistral to be released. And all this new model, 2E and DCLM, all the recent model came because OpenAI was not releasing the best open source models. There was some free. This segment, the best free model, is very attractive for everyone. So when you leave it, you also know that you leave some room for someone. And just like I was saying before, it's very hard to fight on all fronts. So if you want to make the best closed source model, it's very hard also at the same time to stay the best on open source model and not fight also your closed source. You have this very complex thing where you want to try a very good model, but not too good because you're also saying you're. Yeah. So I'm not so worried, and I would say it's kind of fair game, and it's a very dynamic place.
And indeed, I mean, Elon Musk is now kind of forced in a sense to make Grok open source, and they just announced that it will be actually open source. So it shows that it is a complex adaptive system in the way that you react to the strategies of others, and it's not as if there is one optimal strategy that you can just keep forever. You have to adapt.
There is an interesting virtuous circle because we often have vicious circle, but here we have kind of a virtuous circle, just a little bit like open markets where your market is more open and basically you then become richer country, and there is kind of a virtuous thing that make it attractive. We have the same with open model where because someone is open, it forces another one to become open. So there is kind of this thing which are thankfully beneficial, at least if you think like me that open source models are great. Or scary if you think the other way.
So moving on to the very last questions, one that we have not discussed yet is what I will call the infrastructure layer. But regardless of the name, I have here in mind the chips, the computing power. Do you have any concern that concentration at that layer could actually impact the foundation models? And the reason why I'm asking is that obviously, if you are to use a app built on top of of a foundation model that relies on poor infrastructure, and you need to wait for 3, 5, 10 minutes every time you try to prompt the model, this will be unattractive. So, how do you see the interactions between those two layers?
So for sure, hardware is really a key piece in AI, and that's the last piece that you can't really open source, right? Hardware, you need to build it, so you need to buy it, so you can't really download a chip. So that's the thing, that's the limit to open thing. And I would say today it's nice, but it's also a bit scary to see how dominant Nvidia is. It's nice because they definitely powered all the recent development, because we have GPU, we have AI very clearly. But on the other hand, if we have only one company building all the hardware, that's not very healthy. I'm not very worried also because I see all the new chips coming. So I think it take a bit more time because building a chip factory and a chip design is slower than just writing some code. But I think that will be very interesting in the coming years to see, Nvidia being a bit challenged in its position. I mean, they're a really impressive company. Jensen has been through like 3 revolutions already, so they definitely will do great things. But maybe just like for the phones, we'll have the iPhone, and all the other, and then Samsung of chips rising up. Yeah.
And so, in that context, how do you see Hugging Face playing a role? And how do you see the company scaling actually, or if that's even one of your objectives?
I mean, at core, Hugging Face is really all about this idea of a community around sharing, if you take it. So that's also to answer your previous question. I think it's both rather agnostic in models where they really come from. Is Meta the dominant open source player, or is it Google? Does not change so much because the community for us is the same, and there is the same for hardware. Is Nvidia the dominant hardware provider, or should it become AMD? Or doesn't change so much for us. It will still be the same community wanting to use, so we'll adapt. Here again, we have kind of this neutral, kind of almost like an like a judge, or maybe like a more like interface between all these players and the community. So yeah, not so much difference. Just the same for models. We think the more hardware providers and the better are all the chips, the better it is for everyone, I would say. Yeah.
All right, asking one final, nearly impossible question to answer. Do you see, or do you think it will be even one day possible to come up with a power law that underscores the scaling of foundation models, right? So something that would explain the growth of those models, or maybe, generally speaking, the AI ecosystem. Do you see any rule that could inform where things are going?
No. No, I think we're really fully in the land of black swans here. It's like unpredictable long tail stuff. We have this small team of 2 people, that just decided to leave their job for whatever personal reason, because they have been training LLM. They start a startup. They train now the best LLM, totally change the landscape. They decided to settle in Japan because, I don't know, their one is with a Japanese girlfriend, or they just think, law is great there. Now Japan is a superpower of AI. All these things just happen now. It's just, the sad thing is we're kind of even increasing even more the exponential of like fluctuation that we already had with social network and very large scale communication with this, because such a small team can have such outsized impact on the world. it's even harder to predict. Maybe just the size of the models. This is probably something I can roughly predict, and there is like definitely power law, though I think we are above the most of this power law prediction. So we don't even have a very good equivalent of Moore law for just the pure T-flops. Yeah. And it's just a very tiny side of the story, because the T-flops, then what is important is in which model was it, which companies is decided to deploy it. This company is more like open, closed. This company have good engineers, good relation with the media. So many factors can change adoption beside just the pure compute. Yeah.
This reminds me of chaos theory and maybe the early days of social media, where apparently the fact that Ashton Kutcher one day decided to use Twitter at the time was big in creating a momentum and eventually generating a network effect, right? So you have that on the one hand, but on the other, as we also discussed, if no one is doing open source, then it also opens opportunities, which means that eventually someone will take the space. So how deterministic do you think? Is it totally random and black swan-ish, or do we see that it's black swan-ish in the sense that we do not know who will be there, but we kind of know that someone will be in that position?
Yeah, no, okay, yeah, you're right in this. For instance, it's black swan-ish, but maybe maybe the median can still be roughly predicted, or the typical sample of this thing. And for instance, it seems very unlikely that open source will totally disappear, just because of all the complexity, I would say, that needs to align all the law in every country to be together. Otherwise, the incentives are clear that it's easy to get enough money to train a model. It's exciting to do it and to release it. So there will be incentives that make it very unlikely that we see no open source code. Just in software, we have this mix of private, open source. I think we'll have the same in AI. So there is this kind of median thing. Then what is kind of harder to predict is more like the societal, and that's maybe what I was talking about, more like the societal implication of how this thing will change the world in society, because that's where it starts to be important. How you deploy this model, who get access to them, and this question will, how are the people aware? And that's where you start to have this maybe more Ashton Kutcher effect, where, and we see that already today, where some models are also used because they're a bit hypey, because there is a brand around them. Well, it's not clear they're really better than another model. That was probably the same for social network at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. I always thought that if Taylor Swift was to promote one of those models, they would probably, get a big momentum. In any case, I'm very pleased that you are one actor in the space. As I promised when starting this podcast, I would not hide behind my questions. So it is clear that I'm in favor of open source, and I will do whatever I can to push that. So thank you so very much. And on that note, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Thibaut. It was a pleasure.
All right.